Thank you to everyone joining us today online for Session 2, Plant Proteins, the New Age of Food. This is talking about the big picture. Presented by the CSE, we are pleased to have two renowned and very important guests, Scott Exner, partner at MLT Aikins LLP, and Julianne Curran, PhD, Vice President, Market Innovation, Pulse Canada. I'll be your guest moderator. My name is Barrington Miller, Director of Issuer Engagement at the Canadian Securities Exchange. Normally we have separate presentations, but today we have a special combined one, which will run approximately 15 to 20 minutes. After the presentation, we will resort to a Q&A, as well as we encourage our guests and our audience to submit questions in the question box. Should be to the right-hand side. If you missed the first session, you can catch the replay on CSE_TV. I believe that it's been put in the chat box. It'll be available on YouTube, as well as replays on LinkedIn and the other usual social media outlets. Let's begin with some intros. For Scott Exner, he's a partner at the law firm MLT Aikins LLP. For over 25 years, he has provided business and legal advice to agribusinesses across Western Canada, with an emphasis on raising capital and corporate governance. He has been recognized by Chambers Canada as one of the top agribusiness lawyers in Canada. Scott sits on several boards and committees in the agricultural sector, including on the board of Plant Protein Alliance of Alberta. Next, we will have Julianne Curran, who holds a PhD in Human Nutritional Sciences and has worked at Pulse Canada since 2005. In her current role as VP, Market Innovation, Julianne leads the development and implementation of marketing strategies to diversify markets for the Canadian pulse industry. Julianne also works closely with a broad range of stakeholders, including pulse growers associations, food and pulse processing industry, scientists, government, and health professional associations to identify strategic priorities for research related to health, nutrition, processing, and utilization of pulses, and facilitates research to address priority areas. So without further ado, I give you our two presenters, Scott and Julianne.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to sort of give this presentation this afternoon. As Barrington mentioned, we're going to be looking at this at a very high level in terms of the plant protein industry in general. What I'd like to start off talking about, several years ago, the federal government had a report done by Dominic Barton on different ways the Canadian industry could be very competitive on a go-forward basis. Out of that, the federal government set up a federal supercluster initiative. It was a $980 million fund, and it was intended to spur different industries. And if you think of a kind of a Silicon Valley kind of concept, the idea was to spur an industry in terms of growth. They had applications from about 65 industries and awarded 5 winners. You had to set up a nonprofit. One of those nonprofits that received some of the funding is Protein Industries Canada. Its focus is on plant protein processing. And Protein Industries Canada, or PIC for short, was awarded $152 million of that money. Now, basically what Protein Industry Canada does with that money, it accepts applications from companies and consortiums within the industry for funding. So let's say a consortium of 3 companies wanted to get $4 million from PIC. They would apply for $4 million, and they have to come up with their own $4 million of matching funds. So aside from the federal government's $152 million, there'd be matching money of another $152 million from the people who applied for the program. The one thing I like about the program, aside from that roughly $300 million going into the industry in the next 5 years, it also has been a way to sort of untap capital, generally, other investors, lenders, etc. So it's certainly sparking growth in the industry. Now, I want to explain a little bit about sort of just trends generally. We obviously have a growing world population, a growing middle class in a lot of the Asian countries that has resulted in a lot of change in diets. particularly Eastern diets are changing. And with that, there's certainly a lot of health conscious demand out there. People are concerned about allergies, their own sensitivities, and also looking at what impact food production has on the environment. So we've seen that trend for a number of years. Protein crops are sort of one of the answers to that. And when we look at Canada, we're fairly blessed to have large production of protein crops. This is a map showing generally where they're grown in Canada. While there is some in southern Quebec and southern Ontario, for the most part, most of the protein crops are grown across the prairie provinces. When we come to the prairie provinces, we've obviously got a lot of arable land, about 28 million hectares, and we produce about 60 million metric tons of crop each year. 80% of that is high protein crops. Now, typically in Canada, we've been producing the crops, shipping raw material overseas, not a huge amount of processing within Canada compared to other countries. So part of the opportunity here is how can we extract protein out of the crops that we already grow, and can we process those to bring some value added to our production? So I just want to touch on a few categories of the protein crops. Julianne's going to go into a lot more detail on the pulses in a few minutes, but I just want to touch on sort of at a high level the different categories of protein crops. We have pulses first. Canada has a 30-year history of pulse production. We're the largest export in the world of pulses and number one producer of lentils. We certainly have high volume of production, and pulses are generally seen as a healthy and sustainable diet. Now, one of the companies that has certainly helped our pulse production, a company based out of Regina, AGT Foods, they've become the world's largest exporter of pulses. They did a good job convincing farmers in Canada as part of their crop rotation to grow pulses every 3 years. Pulses actually put nutrients back in the soil, so they're great for that purpose. So we've certainly seen a huge growth in our pulse production in Canada over the last 20 years or so. Second category is canola oil. Typically, canola has been grown and we use it to make canola oil as well as meal. The one thing we haven't done enough of probably is trying to extract some of the ingredients out of canola, including protein. And certainly the supercluster has provided an opportunity for some companies to look at new ways to extract that protein out of canola, put into different products, a lot more higher value products, such as aqua feed and other foods. Next category I want to talk about is wheat. Obviously, Canada traditionally has been a very large wheat exporter for many years, whether it's durum wheat that's used in pasta or red spring wheat that's used for bread. Certainly, we'll continue to sort of grow that wheat by looking for new ways to sort of process it as well. Then last, just talk about some other protein crops. When cannabis was legalized a number of years ago, one of the things that sort of went under the radar was the changes to hemp regulation. Hemp was heavily regulated before the legalization of cannabis. With the legalization of cannabis, a lot of those rules were reduced in order to use the entire hemp product. So we're seeing sort of a growth in the hemp production and processing. I often refer to as sort of the unknown cousin of cannabis in terms of the growth potential there. Quinoa, flax, oats, and barley are 4 other products where we can get protein as well. So I just want to sort of round out in terms of the group of proteins that we have. So next I'll turn it over to Julianne.
Great, thank you. So as Scott mentioned, I'm just going to elaborate a bit more on the story for pulses and go into a bit more detail. To start out, just wanted to clarify what we're talking about when we refer to that term pulses. So pulses are the dry edible seeds of potted plants that are in the legume family, but they are different from soybeans and peanuts because pulses have a very low fat content or oil content. And they are also different from fresh peas and fresh beans because they have a very low moisture content. Scott talked about canola and wheat and some of the other crops, and I think some of the things that make pulses unique are its nutritional composition. It's a high carbohydrate plant, similar to wheat, but it actually is really high in protein. And similar to other protein crops, in comparison, it actually has a high fiber content. So that combination of fiber and protein together are really sort of what sets pulses apart. One of the other things to mention as well is that environmental sustainability advantage and the benefits of including pulses in rotations with other crops. And that certainly has been something that producers in Western Canada have really benefited from in terms of the advantages pulses bring in terms of not requiring nitrogen-based fertilizers, but also improving the quality of the soil and also enhancing yields of crops grown in rotation with pulses in subsequent years. So Scott mentioned Canada's position globally in the pulse industry, and I just want to elaborate on that a little further. So this slide is showing global production of pulses and the leading countries or regions. India is by far the largest producer of pulses, but they produce mostly chickpeas and pigeon peas. Canada is the second largest producer of pulses, but actually they are the largest producer, or Canada is the largest producer of peas and lentils in the world. The US, for example, is a large producer of beans. So it really depends on the type of pulse crop that we're talking about in terms of global production, but Canada is a leader in production of peas and lentils in particular. Scott also touched on the fact that Canada is the largest exporter of pulses. And in fact, we export the majority of all the pulse crops that we're growing here in Canada. Pulse production really took off in Canada in the 1990s and has been increasing steadily since then. We now produce on average about 7 million tons per year. And the real growth has been in particular for pea and lentil production. So in this figure here, pea production is the sections in that beige or yellow color, and lentil production is the bars in the green color. So that's where we've seen the most growth. And we do produce small amounts of chickpeas and beans, but that's been relatively stable over the years. So I've been working in the pulse industry since 2005. And when I started, that was really the time when the Canadian industry wanted to place a more significant effort on diversifying markets for the crops that we are growing here in Canada. And when I first started to work in this space, there was a very limited processing capacity of ingredients and not any significant usage or awareness of the ingredients really in high value applications and in the food industry. And so we've seen a lot of growth in this over the past 10 to 15 years. This figure here is just showing the growth in new product launches that contain pulses or pulse ingredients since 2008. So a lot of growth in various food categories that we've seen. However, despite the growth in sales and increased interest, there still is a pretty low volume of pulse ingredients that are used in high-value food applications in comparison to some of these other more well-established ingredients. And so this slide is just showing globally the volumes of plant protein use. And so soy protein concentrate is the most significant ingredient in the plant protein space. And it has been such for quite some time. So a soy protein isolate, which is the bar in orange, that's also pretty significantly used at high volumes, as well as gluten and other vegetable proteins. So the bar in the bottom that's in red, that represents pea protein use. And so, as you can see, it's significantly less than these other plant protein sources. Just to touch on sort of the utilization of these ingredients, currently, North America is a major region for the demand for pea protein. Over the last 10, 15 years, it's been China primarily that's doing most of the processing of pea ingredients, but we're starting to see now the capacity increase in North America and particularly Canada for processing pea protein. This is obviously the North American market is a great opportunity for the processors here in Canada to serve this demands. This amount of pea protein ingredient, about 30,000 or 35,000 tons that's used currently in the food industry, that translates into about 160,000 tons of raw seed that's needed to process that amount of ingredient. And if you recall the production numbers that I showed you for Canada for peas, we produce about 4 million tons of peas. So there's a lot of volume of raw product that could be processed. We wanted to establish what the opportunity was for more processing and more use of the ingredients since we have such a high production base here in Canada for peas. And so we did some modeling. What you're seeing here on the left-hand side of the figure are different food product categories. And I've indicated in the parentheses the inclusion rates that pea protein ingredients would be incorporated in typically into these product categories. This is just based on public information and research. So it could be higher or lower, but we just use these numbers for modeling purposes. And then what we did was we calculated what the volume potential for use of the ingredients would be if 10% of these products in the global marketplace used pea protein ingredients. So we did this for other pulse ingredients as well, but I'm just showing you for pea protein here. So the bars that you see in this green color are showing the volume of pea protein or pulse proteins that would be used if this condition was met, if 10% of the products in the global market incorporated pulse or pea protein at those inclusion rates. And then we converted that into the whole pulse volume that would be needed to process that amount of ingredient. And this translates to about a potential of about 200,000 tons of pea protein ingredient that could be used, and the need for almost 1 million tons of whole pulses or whole peas in the case of pea protein to be processed to serve that demand. So there's a lot of potential for more growth in this industry and for more utilization of the ingredients in a range of food products. Just to sort of further emphasize this point, this shows the categories where pea protein is used compared to gluten and compared to soy protein concentrates and isolates as other sources of plant protein, as you recall from that previous slide. And so the majority of pea protein right now is being used in the milk alternatives category, whereas gluten is being used in baked goods and soy protein concentrate being used in meat substitutes, whereas soy protein isolate type ingredients are being used mostly in the processed meat category. I just wanted to demonstrate or highlight here that there obviously is a lot of room to expand pea protein use into these other categories. And we're also seeing that use of plant protein and these categories themselves is growing. So there's that potential there as well. I talked a lot about pea protein, but other crops that we grow here in Canada, other pulses, are also good options for fractionation and plant protein. This just shows the new product launches of non-pea pulse protein ingredients in the last 5 or so years. And we've seen a lot of interest in faba bean protein in particular. I didn't mention faba bean when I talked about pulse production because it is a relatively small crop in Canada, but one that has been growing. And right now we're hitting at about 100,000 tons a year. But faba bean represents a really good option to substitute for peas, both in terms of production as well as in processing. So that particular ingredient is of interest in growing, as well as bean protein, lentil protein, chickpea protein. So there's a lot of opportunity, I think, to also diversify the plant protein or the pulse protein space, as well as both processors, fractionators, and their customers are looking to diversify their options for plant protein. And this is my last slide. Just want to end off on this point, and then I'm going to pass it back to Scott. But just to highlight Canada's capacity in terms of research expertise in crop production and processing, and in particular for pulses. And Scott mentioned the industry and the growth that we've seen over the last 30 years. A lot of this has been due to the research investments that have been made. Investments into breeding and processing knowledge has really established Canada as a leader in the global pulse industry. So this is one of our great advantages. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and I will pass it back to Scott.
And maybe I'll just finish off with a few comments. So that kind of gives you a high-level overview of the industry. A couple of things I wanted to mention. We already talked about Protein Industries Canada having $152 million to invest in the industry. The other thing that you've got other organizations, one that I'm on the board of is Plant Protein Alliance of Alberta. It was set up as a nonprofit to act as a catalyst in Alberta to grow the industry. And one thing that this organization did in 2019, there's an international protein summit that's held every year in Europe. It's been going on for about 12, 14 years. We're able to sort of bring it to Canada for the first time in 2019 and have several hundred food companies attended. Certainly part of the intent there was to get international investment into Canada in this sector as well. We've certainly seen some of that already. Companies like Roquette, they're a French company. They're building a pea processing plant in Manitoba. We have another one outside of Saskatoon, near Vanscoy being built. So certainly part of the role here in Canada is attracting those foreign companies, that Canada is a good place to invest. We certainly have the crop production for it. The supercluster will add to generating interest both on the investment side and also connecting people. And you've got different other organizations, as I mentioned, that are helping to build the industry as well. So with that, I'll pass it back to Barrington for the Q&A session.
Hi, thank you both. Thank you both for a wonderful presentation. And for our audience, I'd like to remind you that there is a question box just to the right. Let's see. One thing that actually came out was, and I think Scott mentioned this earlier in his presentation, we have a 30-year history of pulses. What were we doing before then? What was going on with pulses in Canada before? Did we not have an industry, or was it relatively underground? That was just a general question.
So I can speak to that. Yeah, so pulse production really didn't start at all in Canada until maybe the late 70s, early 80s, but the levels of production were significantly, obviously very low, not where they are today. And I guess there were some interested growers that wanted to try growing this crop. It grew particularly well in certain regions of the country, Saskatchewan in particular. And so I think after, several years, growers came together and decided to create an organization that would take, levy dollars from producers and put that towards research and, addressing sort of common challenges facing the producers. And so with that, they were able to, over time, invest that into breeding, growing varieties that were resistant to disease, had good quality attributes for the markets that we were serving, and it just really took off from there.
With the acceleration of demand for plant protein products, will we ever see the demand for manufactured products exceed the supply of raw products?
So,
an open question.
yeah. So, from the data that I guess I probably didn't show a lot of this data, but like the data we've seen on forecasted demand for the ingredients is actually a lot lower than the capacity that we will have coming online. So we can definitely serve this. We have plenty of product. As I was trying to show or to demonstrate is that there's a lot more volume potential for usage of the ingredients beyond the forecasted demand. And we can serve that no problem with the capacity already that's sort of been identified to come online.
Maybe one thing I'll add there, Barrington, is worldwide demand for protein is going up. And the other comment we often get is plant protein at the expense of meat protein? And the short answer is no. Both can continue to grow. It's not a zero-sum game. That worldwide demand for protein is strong enough that we can grow more plant protein and process here in Canada without taking away from a lot of the demand for meat protein. So that's sort of a more global perspective, but we certainly don't see the supply outstripping the demand in the short term.
I have in my former life, I used to be a commodities trader, coffee, cocoa, sugar, nat gas, all of those things. And one of my favorite movies is Trading Places. So off of that, what happens in the event of a bad crop season? I don't want to be doom and gloom, but what about crop insurance, and what does that do for the industry? And I have a follow-up question regarding capital markets with that. But yeah, like right now, these are ideal scenarios, but just the what.
And certainly weather plays a part in agriculture, always has. Certainly I would say, yeah, farmers can take out their crop insurance. Can't say I can speak to specific details on all the requirements and the coverage, but it's often a bigger issue for grain handling companies or processors that are located in an area that are hit by drought, for example. So it's more on sort of the handling side that we find a lot of the impacts. But it's certainly, overall, it's sort of something that's always been in the industry. I don't think it's going to stop any growth in the industry just because we may have bad crop years in specific areas. Certainly global warming has affected part of this, but I would say if anything, global warming has added to Canada's competitive advantage when it comes to crops. But Julianne could maybe add some of her comments.
Yeah, I don't have much more to add. Like, I think it's just this has always probably been, kind of an issue to contend with. I think that looking at the options to interchange different crops for one another, and that diversity of supply in processing and ingredient options, I think plays into that a bit, so that you can adjust and adapt as needed. I think that still, again, the bulk of what we're producing here, at least in terms of pulses, is being exported and not being processed, and so we're not at the point where we're so reliant on high volumes in processing that this is kind of an issue or a concern. And I think that we have some advantages here in Canada because of our climate, and producers here have invested more in storage capacity and facilities even on their farms. And so there's ability for things to supply to be available even when there may be an issue with the current crop year. So
we have a question that just came in. Wondering if there are any restrictions, tariff between Canada-US border for crop or final protein product shipping. Thank you for the question.
None that I'm aware of offhand. Certainly a lot of our exports are overseas as opposed to the United States. I'm not as familiar with sort of the requirements for shipping down into United States. Certainly other countries, Canada is seen as a fairly reliable source of crops, and we've got a long-standing history there of reliable production. So, Julianne, I don't know if you had anything else to add on that particular point?
Yeah, I'm not aware of anything either. So nothing further to add.
Related, you started talking about hemp and being the secret cousin of cannabis. That got me thinking about shipping, and related to that tariff question in the U.S., shipping hemp products, because I know it has to have a very low THC count, and as well, what you're shipping it for. Is it for consumption? Is it for fabric? All of those things. I think hemp might actually be a special case. I don't know if you're able to comment on that.
Yeah, certainly hemp is used for a lot of fibers. It's even been used for dashboards in cars, rope, etc. So there's lots of uses for hemp given its strength. With the changes with the cannabis legislation, as you alluded to, Barrington, before hemp had to have a certain level of THC or be below a certain level, and there wasn't an ability to use the entire plant. Now a lot of people are taking the CBD oil out of hemp, make into a lot of different oils and ointments and pharmaceutical products. So yeah, certainly a lot of potential there. And I know a lot of the hemp producers now and processors view it as they basically can utilize, twice as much of the plant as before with the same input costs.
I don't know if this is a two-parter, and the second one is a little bit tongue-in-cheek. But the deck states that Canada is well poised to be a leader in pulse ingredients. What overall impact do you see pulses having on the Canadian economy? What is the global growth opportunity for companies who get into the sector? And do you see Central Canada usurping Toronto as the financial capital of Canada?
Answer the last question. No, I don't see that. But certainly, yeah, we've increased our exports of pulses. We have an opportunity to process more and get more value-added project or products. To me, that's kind of the real value. We certainly have had companies in the last 30 years that have grown by exporting the pulses, whether it be Turkey, India. There, you're obviously subject to the trade reactions in some of those countries, but the growth and just demand for protein generally, whether it be protein bars, aquafeed, things like that, to me, that's the real value. In terms of dollar amounts, certainly Protein Industries Canada would like to see not just $300 million invested in the sector, but $1 billion invested in the sector in the next 5 years. If that is achieved, certainly the impact on GDP is going to be significant. The exact dollar amounts, I wouldn't be able to say specifically, but I think certainly Canada has, this is one area where you have a competitive advantage. The Dominic Barton report sort of identified agriculture as an area where Canada had advantage. So we do just basically have to take this opportunity and run with it. I think it's been recognized as an area of growth. It's more now sort of taking the steps necessary to grow the industry.
Julianne, what do you think?
Yeah, I'd agree, really with everything you said there, Scott, and think that, that is a real opportunity, as was identified in the Barton report, to do more than just ship, all these raw product commodities off to these markets where it's the lowest cost is really all that matters. And so we have an opportunity to enhance the value, do the processing here, and export these ingredients. And do so into markets where quality is important and things like sustainability and food safety, etc. So we're really well positioned to take advantage of that.
And final question before we wrap up this session: the role of government, and when it comes to subsidies and research and things like that, there are I guess there are incentives to grow and push other crops, and other ones sort of got left to the wayside, and we see prices increase. And what's your opinion as to how much the government should play a role in this industry and where it's going into the future?
I think the federal government at least has made a good start through the Supercluster Initiative. I think identified this sector as one that's pegged for growth. If we go back and, for example, canola was developed in Saskatoon, canola oil, and it has become one of the major crops in Western Canada over the last 50 years. Sometimes you certainly need that catalyst to spark some new innovation. Western Canada, I think, is blessed with a lot of research centers, whether it's the Duke Processing Center, the work that's done at Olds College, the work at University of Saskatchewan. Certainly there's a role for government to act as a catalyst. I think where private sector money does come in, though, is certainly on the processing side and making the investments in infrastructure to take those crops and turn them into value-added projects. So I think the government involvement, while needed, will only go so far. We do need private sector money being invested in the industry as well.
Well, with on that note, I would like to take the opportunity to say thank you to both our presenters, Scott Exner from MLT Aikins, Julianne Curran from Pulse Canada. For those who are here with us, we have one more session. It's at 2:15 Mountain Time. We'll have Crystal Allen, who's also a partner with MLT, and Dr. Steve Webb, CEO of the Global Institute for Food Security, talking about the challenges of meeting the demand and developing new products. Thank you to our attendees for your time today. Please visit these company websites, ask questions. We will try and make these presentations available both in hard copy as well as online. Don't forget to subscribe to CSC TV, which is located on YouTube, where you can find replays of this presentation. Thank you, Scott, and thank you to our guests. I've been your host, Barrington Miller from the Canadian Securities Exchange.